On February 7th, President Trump issued his very first executive order that pertains to firearms. It is called Protecting Second Amendment Rights. And it starts with Section 1, which is, I'll just read it for you here. The Second Amendment is an indispensable safeguard of security and liberties. It has preserved the right of the American people to protect ourselves, our family, and our freedoms since the founding of our great nation. Because it is foundational to maintaining all other rights held by Americans, the right to keep and bear arms must not be infringed. So this is a fantastic statement, but does it mean anything? Will this executive order do anything? What's actually going on? So Section 1 is a fantastic statement. It is very solid and stronger than I actually would have expected. And then Section 2 is a directive to the new Attorney General to examine the federal government to find infringements, shouldn't be too hard, and then develop a plan of action to do Section 1, to defend the right to keep and bear arms. And this actually has a time frame on it here. There's a 30-day timeline from February 7th to March 9th to come up with a plan and then present that plan to the president. Now, I think this is actually really good. If you'll recall, President Trump did not run his second campaign on gun rights really any more than he did his first campaign. And his record in his first term was not so good on gun rights, and then his Attorney General, well, she's very soft on gun rights. So this is in some ways a pleasant surprise. Now, you could nitpick a little bit. You could say he promised to address guns in his first week. This came out 2.5 weeks into his term, so he's missed the deadline slightly. But, you know, he didn't have a Solicitor General. The Attorney General proceedings got delayed. I can kind of stretch a point and say I'm encouraged by this. But more than that, I've got input. I have some suggestions on what else needs to be added to the plan. First, let's talk a little bit about what the president is specifically asking for. He's asking his new Attorney General to examine several things at a minimum in order to find the infringement. So number one is, not surprisingly, all the presidential actions of the previous administration. And then number two, all rules made by the DOJ. And then specifically the ATF is called out here, which is nice because they do, you know, most of the stuff in the firearms space. And then number three is neat. It is the zero tolerance policy we've talked about before, which has resulted in a ton of FFLs having their licenses revoked for tiny paperwork mistakes. That's also known as the enhanced regulatory enforcement policy. And that's good that is in here. There's also a command to look at all the rules and reports generated by the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, which is no longer in existence. I think it got unburdened by what has been, or something like that. And then, this is kind of a bigger one, positions taken by the United States in all ongoing litigation. This is a very big deal because there are a lot of current lawsuits going both ways, by the way. And then the last two are agency classifications of firearms and ammo, and then manufacturing, transfer, export applications for firearms. I will talk about those a little bit later too. But first, let's see how far this actually goes. The first two items are actually time limited to Joe Biden's term, January 2021 through January 2025. Trump is very focused on stuff that Biden and the Democrats have done recently, not going all the way back to 1934, which it would be nice. Now, part of this might be just because, well, it's a little personal. The Biden administration spent a huge amount of their time trying to erase everything that Trump did in between 2017 and 2021. So this is just kind of, you know, tit for tat. But also, the Biden government built a ton of obstacles for Trump and conservatives going into the future. And President Trump is now tackling those in many ways. So I understand the focus on those 4 years specifically. But it is a little disappointing because there's a long history of infringements that need to be addressed. However, what is encouraging, I think, is the inclusion of that zero tolerance policy. Now, I'm not saying it's a small deal. It's a very big deal. It's a major implication for small businesses when they lose their FFLs. Mom and pop gun shops are really reliant upon that as a business avenue. And it's a huge injustice to lose that for a tiny little paperwork violation, which is usually just a mistake. Like I've heard stories of on the ATF Form 4473, if you get county and country mixed up and the FFL holder doesn't notice that, that could be the end of their business. However, in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of a small issue. Even though it's a record number of revocations, it is still only about, last I checked, 1,000 FFLs that lost their licenses, which makes it kind of a niche issue, which means that it's great that it's been noticed in this executive order. That, I think, to me is a sign that this isn't just a performative thing. Most voters, most donors probably wouldn't know this. And then there's the lawsuits, point number 5. This is kind of a big deal. The Department of Justice has already requested abeyance, which is like a timeout suspension for all their Second Amendment cases for the next 30 to 60 days while they figure stuff out. This is normal because we have a brand new Attorney General who is now in office. Pam Bondi is going to inherit all of Merrick Garland's cases. So all these pending cases that we've talked about in previous videos and podcasts and newsletters, Mock versus Garland, Vince versus Garland, Green versus Garland, Atkinson versus Garland, Vanderstock versus Garland that we talked about in this video, these are all Pam Bondi's cases now. It's now Vanderstock versus Bondi. She is technically the defendant in these cases, which means that things now get kind of complicated. The people who brought these cases don't actually want to drop them. They want a ruling. They want precedent to be established, not just a settlement. They have spent years battling these things out, setting these things up, working through the courts. And the strategic thing for them to do is to continue running these cases. So Gun Owners of America, Firearm Policy Coalition, Second Amendment Foundation, there's a whole bunch of other people that have put a lot of time and effort into these cases, and they want to say in what happens. And then on the other side, we also have cases that the DOJ has brought against gun owners and businesses. Usually those cases are brought by the ATF. And the Attorney General can now drop those, but I think the defendants in many of those cases they don't just want that stuff to go away. They want to be vindicated in a court of law. They probably want justice, not just the new administration to dismiss stuff. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be worked out, and it is going to be case by case. So it's good to include these in the executive order, especially as it relates to point number 2, some of those ATF rule changes. However, this is one of those points that's, you know, it could just be business as usual. The DOJ always has a lot of cases. The new Attorney General always needs to pick them up or drop them or fight them to completion or settle in a way that does the most good for the administration. So that's kind of normal. And if you are skeptical, I get it, because I remember when Pam Bondi was the Attorney General of Florida, and she made a number of bad calls on gun control legislation. And she was way too complimentary of red flag laws, and she overtly fought to keep handgun purchases illegal for those under 21. And I also remember Trump's first term, his take them first, due process later comments, his suppressor comments, and then later, of course, the bump stock ban. But the worst thing about Trump's first term was probably how much business of usual there was, the most basic Republican business. He failed to drain the swamp, he failed to get his own guys in, and it was, not great. However, this term is already a little bit different. There's been much more swamp draining, and he's got many more of his own guys into position. He's been moving very fast. Shock and awe. We actually talked about that in last week's podcast. Some very hardcore appointments have prevailed against heavy opposition, and the opposition is kind of getting cut down. So I am extremely curious to see how Pam Bondi handles this position and the directives that are in this executive order. Will it be the bare minimum that Trump asked for, Or could it be more? Because I'll be honest with you, there is a lot more that the White House should do beyond the bare minimum, or even the 7 points that she is supposed to investigate now. Now, some of this extra stuff Donald Trump could do right now without waiting on the Attorney General. The Commerce Department is already reviewing the 2023 ban on firearm exports, and that's just a Biden administration move. It's a very easy reversal. Also, it represents tens or possibly hundreds of millions of dollars worth of American manufacturing. So the export ban would be an obvious thing for Trump to overturn. And then there's import stuff, like the ATF ban on importing non-lethal training ammo for civilians. Another bizarre thing that's just happened during the Biden administration without any explanation, just in the last couple of years. No more simunitions for guys like Lucas and other T-Rex Arms people. It's just kind of bizarre and absurd stuff. And that's how most of the import-export stuff has gone. It's been small, death by 1,000 cuts sort of stuff. It's been done by executive order or executive action, or maybe just by rule change, which means it could all be reversed by the White House just as quickly. So Bush and Clinton, for example, both ordered import bans. In 2013, the Obama administration stopped almost all military surplus firearm importation with a new executive action. It wasn't even an executive order, let alone a law. It wasn't even a ban, it was just new instructions. Instructions to universally deny all importation permission requests, even though the importing is still technically legal. So stuff like this could just get swept away. And maybe some of this will be covered by the last two instructions of this executive order. There's a lot more stuff that we could do, but it is a start. And while we're talking about foreign entanglements, there are some other legal protections for Americans against lawsuits. This doesn't fall under the direct DOJ caseload of point number 5, but did you know that the nation of Mexico is currently suing American gun manufacturers, private companies, right now for damages because cartel members are killing Mexican citizens with Glocks and Berettas and Smith & Wessons, etc. And last week, the Mexican president threatened to expand that lawsuit if the U.S. State Department classifies the cartels as terrorist organizations, which, if I'm understanding this properly, means that if the U.S. government tries to protect America's private citizens who are being damaged by foreign cartels, the Mexican government will then try to damage America's private businesses, and gun companies are, an easy target. They have some of the fewest legal protections and some of the strictest liability requirements of any business, which is something that the White House should address. And then, while we're talking about Mexico, this just popped into my mind right here. Remember that a lot of the guns that actually did cross the border and went directly into the hands of the cartel, undeniably so, did so under the direct supervision of the ATF. And there has never been adequate accountability for that fast and furious scandal. And that is something that definitely needs to be addressed. And obviously at this point, there are a number of people calling for dissolving the ATF in its entirety. There's legislation that has been filed to do this. And if you have watched our series on the history of the ATF, you know that I don't know that this is necessarily the best idea, because as dark as that bureau's history is, it is a relatively small department with a relatively small budget. It's a mere $1.9 billion last year. So if you erase the ATF tomorrow, all of its people and responsibilities and budget and resources will probably be absorbed by the FBI, where there will be even less accountability, not to mention no justice for past wrongs of a no longer existing bureau. And besides, the real issues are some of the laws that are on the books from the 1934 National Firearms Act onwards. Those are the laws that violate the Second Amendment. Those are the laws that must be repealed. Now again, Donald Trump is largely focused on stuff that Joe Biden, his administration, Democrats in general, have done very recently, not so much 90 years ago. But there are some recent bills that do infringe on Second Amendment rights. The Violence Against Women Act and the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act both give a frightening amount of power to the federal government, as well as huge budgets to be spent on gun control efforts, even bribing states to pass gun control bills. So that legislation and all those budgetary earmarks, those can go. And for at least the next 2 years, there is a relatively friendly Congress. And so the recommendation, I would say, from the Attorney General, must include that some existing laws be repealed. It's really the only way that we can have actual long-term legal headway getting made. So it really needs to be part of the plan that the Attorney General puts forth on March 9th, which is soon. We don't have a whole lot of time to get all this stuff figured out. But the good news is a lot of stuff is already happening in the executive branch that affects gun control. This right here is the very first executive order that directly addresses Second Amendment stuff, but there's already been some very positive change. With USAID being shut down and all sorts of other grants, subsidies, contracts being canceled, we are saving money. But it's more than that. If you check out datarepublican.com, which is a database of federal funds, and I'll put a link down below, it shows that a ton of taxpayer money was trickling down to various gun control organizations, and that is now ending. That will have a positive effect. It will make education easier. It will make law changes easier. It will just make talking about this stuff easier. And the ongoing draining of the swamp and the pruning of the brambles and the removal of the bureaucrats will, in general, make securing our rights and removing those infringements easier. Which is why my next suggestion probably seems a little counterintuitive. I believe that what we need in the executive department is a gun rights czar. Not a gun czar, not a gun violence or safety office, but a gun rights office that specifically looks out for the American people. The executive order mentions actions that purport to promote safety but may have impinged upon the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. That's an incredibly easy thing to do, even by accident. If you get tunnel vision, it is really easy for legislation or policy or regulations issued by an agency or department or bureau to have incredibly destructive unintended consequences, which is a good argument for a gun rights czar to exist. Now, my next statement is probably going to be even more controversial. I do not believe that he should be a member of law enforcement. I'm not saying that it should necessarily completely rule out anyone who's ever been like a reserve deputy or has a little bit of experience, but it really should not be a career cop. In her confirmation hearings, Pam Bondi said that she might appoint a seasoned law enforcement officer as the new director of the ATF. And I think that would be a mistake. Even if you found a guy who wanted that job, had that kind of track record, who was honorable, he would still be an insider who probably has developed over his career tunnel vision. Law enforcement officers get tunnel vision on catching bad guys, the same way that bureaucrats, this is the nicest way I can possibly say this, get tunnel vision in building their managerial processes. And then both of these two tunnel vision end up treating good guys kind of the same way, not as individuals, but as a sort of a resource to be suspected and or managed. The Justice Department right now has a ton of agents chasing bad guys. The bad guys sometimes have guns, in the same way that they also sometimes have cars or phones or money. And then these law enforcement agents sort of start getting suspicious of any people who have guns or cars or phones or money. And then they get very nervous about politicians who want to take away their ability to trace guns or cars or phones or money because it makes it easier to catch bad guys. Even small town police departments here in Tennessee have told me we want to keep some of the worst gun laws on the books because it's some of the only ways that we can actually get bad guys charged. The judges will not give them the sentences for the drugs that we want, the judges will only put them in prison for the gun laws. So we need to keep the gun laws on the books because it's the only way to work around some of these other systemic issues that exist. And I believe that we need a gun rights czar who doesn't have this tunnel vision so that he can speak up for the rights of all Americans, protect them from overzealous agents or bureaucrats or legislators who purport to promote safety but end up impinging upon Second Amendment rights in the process. This gun rights office would need to be probably a little bit like DOJ. It would need to be outsiders who can fix the things that the insiders can't see. And it should probably include some people from the gun industry because no other group really has that level of insight into the gun owners of the United States. Now I realize that this recommendation might sound a little bit self-serving as somebody in the gun industry who makes product for the gun owners of America, but I am serious. I think that the White House needs to make gun rights a very, very high priority. And in fact, it might actually be a hard requirement for Trump's future success in office. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, this is Donald Trump's last term. Does he really need to do this? He doesn't really need to do anything. But if you'll remember, his first term was almost completely undone by Joe Biden and his administration. So even though Donald Trump is not angling for re-election, he does want a legacy of, I would say, unswervable cultural and institutional change. He wants to accomplish something that will be non-reversible. It's not just a popular movement that he needs. He needs to build a bulwark against destruction. In our history of the ATF series, we saw lots of little course corrections being made to the ATF over the last several decades, but they were always temporary. The Bureau would just jump back onto the wrong tracks. To get the nation back on the right tracks, I think Trump needs more than just popular political wins that trend well on Twitter. He needs a strong team and strong goals. And my next theory is even more controversial than my opinion on the need for a gun rights czar. But give me a second to lay it out. I think that Second Amendment stuff is going to be key for that strong team and those strong goals. I know that he did not campaign heavily on Second Amendment stuff, and it's certainly not his strongest issue personally, but it's a very important one for unity because Trump needs guys who stay on mission, not just follow trends or have their own personal agendas. Vivek is a great example of this because Trump did campaign very heavily on border stuff, and illegal immigration was, and still is, so wildly out of control that everybody almost agreed that something had to be done. It was a pretty inescapable conclusion for anybody with a brain. But that didn't mean that people were on the same page about what to do. And after the election, as conversation continued, some differences arose. And the infighting inside of the camp was kind of rough. Another thing that Trump campaigned very heavily on was killing inefficiency and corruption. What DOJ is doing so far is great. But so far, the inefficiency of the federal government is so ludicrously gargantuan that almost everybody is on board with cutting costs. And almost every cost that is getting cut is a good one. And efficiency is a great rallying cry. But part of the reason it's a good rallying cry is because everyone with a brain would like a smaller government. But that is not necessarily unity. It's only people that have a really principled view of the Second Amendment that want a small government, not just a smaller government. So this kind of needs to be a litmus test for faithfulness to the mission, not as a way of excluding people, but as a true north, as a really specific goal. There's lots of room for differences of opinion on a lot of the procedural stuff, but if there isn't unity on the core mission and there isn't a specific destination or some anchors that people can grab a hold of, there will be a lot more infighting and disconnected factions, and at best, that means a loss of momentum. But if President Trump is able to lean heavier into the Second Amendment as a litmus test, if he actually holds to this statement that we have on the beginning of this executive order about protecting the rights of Americans, that's going to be really helpful. And he will get mission guys, because on this issue, there really are only two sides. There are the disarmers, and they want to empower government, even if they don't understand that that is what they're doing. Disarming the people and infringing on Second Amendment rights is empowering government. Then on the other side, you have people who would like to arm the populace. What they want to do is empower people, not the government. This question, who should have the monopoly on violence, is a very key question. It's very basic, it's very simple, but it forces you to take one of two sides on whether the Second Amendment is just a nice bit of cultural history or the ability to have things that are fun to shoot, or whether it is a necessary recognition of a fundamental right. And I do really like this introductory statement. The Second Amendment is an indispensable safeguard of security and liberty. It has preserved the right of the American people to protect ourselves, our families, and our freedoms since the founding of our great nation. Because it is foundational to maintaining all other rights held by Americans, the right to keep and bear arms must not be infringed. I like that. It could be stronger, but it's a start. For years, the left has talked a lot about raising awareness, which often feels like it's just kind of a distraction. It hasn't really had a lot of effect at reaching up into the halls of power, but it actually kind of does now. Also, the left has been complaining that our democracy is in jeopardy right now, but I can't remember when I've ever seen a White House or a White House staff that is more connected to individual Americans and more receptive to those individual American interests. You also see people complaining about policy by tweet, but that is real. It's sort of happening now. If regular citizens point something out, often on Twitter, and it gets noticed, it actually gets addressed. If you find a few million or, just a paltry $1 billion being spent on a program that does things like trans comic books in Guatemala, that will actually get noticed and something will actually happen. If you boost tweets that point things out like that, it can have an effect. I mean, think about this. If 7 or 8 million people learn about a piece of waste and abuse inside of the government, that's actually a lot of people. Remember that 77 million people voted for Trump by last count. That means that 10% of his mandate, the people that sent him to office, are now aware of this thing. And that is pretty doable. A couple months ago, I had a tweet hit 9 million views, but unfortunately it was about cars and not about guns. But a heavy push on Twitter actually does something now that it's X. And so now I would say is the time for some unprecedented activism on Second Amendment stuff and some strong pressure. And you can call the White House directly. They have a phone number. The switchboard is 202-456-1111, and you can talk to people at the White House about what you want them to do. But also on the internet, there is value in digging up some of these embarrassing things. Primarily, I would do it about the ATF. I think that's going to be effective, but also there's no shortage of material. And some of it is already out there and getting a fair amount of play, like when the White House ordered all the DEI stuff to get shut down, somebody noticed and took screenshots of the ATF website as they changed all their DEI officers over to chief executives, just quickly to slip that under the rug. There's just so many things that we could bring up and talk about more, like The Firearm Owners Protection Act, which was passed way back in the 1980s, very explicitly forbids the ATF from maintaining a registry of gun owners, not to mention probably some other amendments in the Bill of Rights. But the ATF revealed pretty recently, I think it was last year, that they have a searchable database of more than 1 billion records. And if that's not a registry, I'm kind of not sure what is. Also, DOJ should be asking questions like, what is this illegal database actually costing us? The sheer waste of funds on some of these projects is probably amazing, but we don't even have to look at projects like that. Just some of the prosecutions that the ATF pursues are incredibly wasteful. They're also very unjust. Let's throw out a couple of examples that we should try to amplify here. One was the massive investigation and prosecution of Patrick Tate Adamiak. I think that's how you say his name. He is a U.S. Navy sailor. Or was. The ATF spent a huge amount of time and a huge amount of money and a huge number of agents to investigate his replica gun collection. Then the ATF lab spent a huge amount of time trying to rebuild his demilled RPG-7, adding a whole bunch of parts that he in fact did not own to prove that he could have activated this thing. Dozens of agents, probably years of actual process, and who knows how much money was spent ruining his career and putting him in prison for 20 years. At the moment, he is trying to raise enough money so that he can file an appeal. That's the kind of story that we need more eyeballs on. And there's all kinds of these stories. David Chiafurli is a federal air marshal, or was, because dozens of ATF agents spent months building a case around him. They dragged him into his office, they interrogated him, and then after they let him go, they raided his house and smashed up his farm and confiscated a bunch of his stuff and dragged his wife and kids out at gunpoint. He lost his security clearance and therefore his job when he was indicted for owning suppressors, which turned out to be inline oil filters. And somehow they managed to convict him anyway. There are so many stories like this, but I probably can't go into a whole lot more because my cameraman gets justifiably furious when we talk about this stuff, and then the footage gets a little shaky. So do some research on these kinds of cases. Get on X, get on email, get on the phone. Make sure that some of these issues and suggestions are on the record before March 9th. The likelihood that they actually end up in the plan from the Attorney General are much higher if we do that. But even after March 9th, these are the kinds of stories that should be getting more traction. These are exactly the kinds of infringements and abuses that we need to be bringing to the attention of our legislators, our Attorney General, and our President. Because he's right. The Second Amendment is an indispensable safeguard of security and liberty, and we have a lot of ground that we need to recover.